Show started today with an interview with Professor Philip Dalton. So, held monthly during the academic year, the Center for Race Colloquia Series sees Hofstra's faculty members invited to present their recent publications and engage with new scholarship focusing on race, culture, and social justice. The series returns today with Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Public Advocacy and Director of Hofstra's Center for Civic Engagement, Philip Dalton, discussing a 1930s era mural in Elgin, Illinois, that sparked racial controversy in 2016. Professor Dalton joins us now in studio to preview his talk titled, quote, Condemning Racial Terror Appropriately, a critique of an anti-racist mural in Elgin, Illinois. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Professor.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we touched on it a little bit in the introduction, but could you elaborate further on the details of your talk?
Sure. I mean, I'll give you a snapshot of the circumstances around it. You described it as a 1930s era mural. It actually was produced in 2007, but it was titled American Nocturne 1932. And that was a misleading title given to the mural. The person who was commissioned to make the mural had been commissioned to make several of them. And this one was supposed to deal with the issue of racism. And so he decided he would make what he described as a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Not controversial, but provocative mural. And it's of a crowd at a 1930 Marion, Indiana lynching. And it, according to him, was intended to criticize the potential for white people and their potential for this kind of race terror. When it was found out before it was unveiled, a member of the city government asked him what it meant, and he told him what it was. And the person said, well, it's never going up. And he said, well, if that's what it means, then I'll just change the name. So he disguised the name, and it was up there for 10 years before somebody finally figured it out.
So what's specific about the history of the mural that sparked your curiosity in it?
Less the history than that it was an anti-racist, anti-race terror mural that African Americans wanted removed. And so as a person living on Long Island, learning about this from people I know in Illinois, I thought, well, that's interesting. How could that have happened? So that's when I started digging into it.
Since you are a professor of rhetoric, how did you approach the mural's depiction and message?
It's a good question. I could get into theory here, and I don't know how many people you want tuning out. But there's an area of my discipline in rhetoric called Epidectic. That's a mouthful in the morning. But it's ceremonial talk. And it can be done well and it can be done poorly. The the version of it that you're probably most familiar with is that of a eulogy. If somebody passes away, and this is considered, when done well, a form of persuasion. But what are you persuading people of at a eulogy? Well, you are reinforcing certain values. And when it's done really well, you can make people feel it. Like you can feel really buoyed by that. But that's a talk of praise. There's another version to it called a talk of blame. And there aren't a lot of instances of that. We don't get up very often and criticize each other in public, and we don't point to those moments as moments of high eloquence. But we do it, right? Political argumentation sometimes. I criticize my opponent, and I can do it badly. I can cause backlash or boomerang effect, and that's when it's done poorly. But sometimes I could do it in such a way that it drives home a message and may really paint a clear picture for my audience about someone's virtues or lack thereof versus my own, which I would have you to believe are very, very good, very strong.
So what about the controversy surrounding this mural do you feel makes it a relevant topic in 2022?
Well, because there's so much going on at the present moment, removing statues and criticizing some murals that are dated. We're in a moment where people are more aware of the implications of how different communities view things that are displayed in public. Where there are more audiences being taken into consideration when these assessments and judgments are made about what should go up or what should be commissioned or what should be removed. So given that, then this is right where, in a lot of respects, our culture is right now, is trying to figure out what's appropriate for a multicultural and diverse society as we grapple with acknowledging all the different voices and all the different opinions that we have in our communities.
So what went into preparing your talk then? Did anything happen during preparation that you found, especially interesting?
I interviewed a lot of people, and I got a lot of access. I interviewed the artist for over 2 hours. At the time I interviewed him, he was being reviled by a lot of people in the community. He's an interesting cat. He's a white man. His father was a famous person in Elgin. He was out front on race matters in the 60s. There's as radio people, I don't know if you've ever heard of Floyd Kalber, but he was the voice of Chicago radio, even when I was a child. And he was African American, and he couldn't buy a home in Elgin because of redlining. David Powers, the artist's father, co-signed his loan so he can move in. And this caused people to dislike the man because he was on the front end of race issues. He understood himself this way, as being on the front end of these sorts of things, and so took it upon himself to make the arguments for them without considering their points of view. And by them, I mean the African-American citizens of Elgin. Anyway, it's a complex issue because he's being condemned as potentially racist when at the same time he understands himself to be very much an advocate for, maybe not an ally with, the black community in Elgin.
So what was that like for you, talking to somebody who was in the center of so much controversy at the time? Like, did you feel like you had any bias while talking to him based on what was going around?
I don't feel like I had bias, but I always have to be careful when you're doing research like that to not give signals of like appreciation or something like that. But sometimes you want to give some indication that I'd like you to continue with what you're saying. But what was it like? It was an extraordinary amount of access. Like I said, we talked for over 2 hours. He said I couldn't meet with him unless I brought him a 6-pack of beer, which I thought was that. I've never heard that before, and I probably won't ever again. I don't know. I never thought of it that way when I was with him. Like, this is strange for me to be able to. I felt lucky. As strange as that may sound, somebody is being looked at by members in the community as racist. I feel lucky that I get the access, but from a research standpoint, I was lucky I had that much access. And then he was able to open the door to other people who helped produce the mural, such as he worked with students who helped paint it, and there were other members of the community in what was called it was an art group called the OEG, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, who wanted nothing to do with it. Because once they were all found out, folks went quiet, and one of them opened up. And he was of particular interest to talk to because he was a black resident of Elgin very early on, who had fascinating stories about coming in as the first black teacher in Elgin. Anyway, the access he granted, the points of view that were shared with me were really varied, and I was lucky. I was lucky.
And although the mural was taken down, what would you say is the lasting impact that it left not only on the people of Elgin, Illinois, but on the fight for racial equality and justice in general?
Well, I can't say that what happened in Elgin impacted the fight for racial justice in general. I can't say that it did much of that. I think, and this is another project I'm working on related to this specific controversy, Elgin is unique in that this occurred and at a time when some cities were dealing with large-scale protests related to policing issues and race. And this occurred, and it unfolded pretty peacefully. And that's not to say it wouldn't have warranted a less peaceful response. It is to say that the city had been actively working to foster lines of communication across different communities. And this was a response to some of their own policing issues that they'd experienced. So you had, I wouldn't call it a very diverse government, but it's a multiracial, multi-ethnic government. And they were working with pastors in the community. They created a group that was like a summit that would meet regularly between police, pastors, community leaders, and government leaders. And it was, I think it was off the books. That's not to say they were hiding it. It just wasn't open publicly. But it was just a place where people, when things happened, could get together and talk and speak truth and know it wouldn't end up in the papers. So they had done some really smart things, I think, to make certain that people were being listened to. And then once the mural was removed, there was another protest after George Floyd was murdered, and the stores, anticipating protests, boarded up, and then people went around and painted on the boards. And then this inspired a replacement mural where they took images from the boards and created a montage of different things that were inspired by those paintings. But if anything, if there's a takeaway here, there's a few. But I'd say with regard to your question, it's important for governments to work to make sure that people from different points of view, different perspectives are involved both in the formal areas of government, but also that there's regular and constant communication going on between the different communities that make up our neighborhoods or our cities.
And finally, Professor, do you have any final thoughts or anything else you'd like to say regarding your talk this afternoon?
Oh, I don't know. Please come. It'll be in Roosevelt 203 at 1 o'clock. It is interesting. We'll talk about deception because the artist deceives folks. But we'll also talk about how sometimes in some people's efforts to be advocates for, they may feel as though they can supplant the voices for others without working alongside or in step with the people they're trying to work and help. And so this is a great illustration of where that goes wrong and can help inform other efforts to recognize these events in our history that really need to be recognized and never forgotten.
And once again, that was Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Public and Advocacy, as well as the Director of the Center for Civic Engagement, Philip Dalton, here to preview his talk at the Center for Race Colloquia Series, quote, Condemning Racial Terror Appropriately, a critique of an anti-racist mural in Elgin, Illinois. The talk will be from 1 to 2:25 p.m. today in Roosevelt Hall, and advanced registration can be done at news.hofstra.edu. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks again for having me.